Mobile Legends Reddit community. This is Pink Pokita, and I'm here to give a commentary to my PowerPoint presentation about the different kinds of MLBB drafts. So I made this commentary because I believe 20, 19, 20 pictures are not enough to explain the complexity of these drafts. So this is an extended version. You can listen to it if you're too busy to watch a YouTube video. And I'm not going to read this PowerPoint like we do in school. In the old times, we just read the slides. So um, MLBB had a rich history, so I've been playing since 2017. And every few months, sometimes every few weeks, things change. So um, I think the meta was very volatile up to 2020, and it's after Project Next that the meta has a bit stabilized. It's still very dynamic, but there the introduction of different kind of lanes fixed the meta into a specific identity that MLBB had been trying to find since it was made. So you may ask yourself, how would I benefit from this guide? I'm just in a low rank, or I'm just a solo queue player. My teammates never adjust. I'm always a tank. So I understand that because I solo queue a lot. But the knowledge that you get from guides and from watching professional teams, I think they can help us understand the win conditions, how your team can win, even though if you're behind or you think there's no more hope, and maybe for knowledge sakes. So I also assume you know the very basics when listening to this guide. So I assume you know what a jungler is, what a mage is, etc., etc. So this is the basic outline of my presentation. And first group of team compositions are what I call balanced. These terms I just uh, came I made these terms. So not necessarily I assigned these labels to these teams. I didn't have a book, a guide, or copy it. I didn't copy it from any other guide. So this is my own language, and if you disagree, it's okay. I understand. You can comment it. And the first group is balanced team compositions. These are the teams that I believe to be best for beginners and has less risk. While offensive teams, they're self-explanatory. They center on attack and aggression. And I'm going to touch the little bit of history in the last portion of my guide, the obsolete drafts of hyper carry and mid lane junglers. Excuse me. So, quick review. The keyword here is archetypes. So, archetypal heroes. Archetypes came from RPGs or old MOBAs. So, the jungler, again, I assume you already know these kinds of roles. Uh, the archetypal role for junglers are assassins or fighters because they can move fast. They're able to take one objective and the other, carry early game, and benefit from the accelerated level 4. And roamers are typically tanks and supports because they have the tools to either frontline or heal allies, give movement buff, etc. And mid laner, so why mage? So in MLBB, it's mostly mage. I'm aware that League of Legends have other heroes in the mid lane. So why mage? Because the mid laner requires a good wave clear, a a hero that could be strong in team fights because it's a very strategic location. And we have the gold laner with that are expected to deliver high damage and carry the team late game. So if you put a tank or in early game hero in the gold lane, it's like it defies logic. Of course, there are certain exceptions, but you get the idea. And the Exp Laner, experienced laner, a hero that benefits from early level 4, and the turtle always spawns at the side of the XP lane. So the XP Laner is expected to help with the turtle. So it's typically a fighter or a tank because they're expected to hold the lane and to able uh, to be independent from the team and manage waves. They're usually expected to split away from the group. Not necessarily split push, but able to take care of themselves without the roamer. So it's just a quick review. The guide will not focus on the in-depth explanation of roles. So let's go first to the traditional team composition, the most basic and archetypical team. And it's very straightforward. So I explained earlier why certain roles are inclined to be populated by a certain class. So the pros of a traditional team is that it's so defined. So a tank is the roamer and the tank goes front line. It's so simple. And the mages and the marksmen do damage. That's it. Fighters are all-rounders. And that because it's so simple and straightforward, it's great for solo queue, great for beginners. And it's the most balanced team composition because it has everything. It has early game for your mid or your jungler. It has late game for your marksman. It has a tank support who could tank damage and act as a frontline. And yet it has the Exp Laner, an independent hero that can do almost everything. So can clear waves, can tank, can escape, can push, can a jack of all trades. But the cons of this team is that it's predictable because it's so standard, so basic. And since it's so basic, the more experienced players will be able to take advantage of the weak spots they could see in this draft. And I forgot to put this in the presentation, but in a team of two traditional teams fighting each other, it will really boil down to hero picks and individual skills of the player. So that's where the term gapping belongs. So anyways, there are examples of traditional teams in the M4 World Championships. So example 1, it's a very well-rounded team. So Lilia offers the team both area spells. Lilia is a great hero against slow tanks particularly, and magic damage. And we have Claude. We have Lolita, a fighter, a tank support. And you get the idea. It's so well-rounded. And there's another example. The first example, our jungler is a fighter, Leomord. Second example is Hayabusa. Very fast assassin objective taker. So if you watched M4 and saw Kyrie's performance, it's amazing. I highly recommend people who want to learn Hayabusa to witness how Kyrie plays him. Of course, we might never get to his level, but it's pure speed, agility, and evasion. So in the example 2, we have Grok and Yu Zhong for XP and Roam, and Eve as Eve is a very long range mage, and Beatrix for gold. So straightforward. Example 3 is not so straightforward, I guess, because there's no tank or a strict tank class hero, but we have a support fighter, Kaja, and a strong frontliner. The tank job kind of went into Lapu-Lapu. So these are all examples of a traditional team composition. So there's a marksman, assassin fighter, tank, and etc. So since that was the traditional and the archetypal, the other team we discussed, there's the players have learned to modify it. So that's why I called it modified. And at first glance, if you think about it, it does fill all the roles needed in a traditional team. It's well rounded, but the heroes can be unconventional. So instead of a tank being the roamer, sometimes the tank becomes just the jungler. The assassin becomes the roamer, blah blah. So it's still traditional but switch. A lot of roles are a lot of hero classes are switched. So the modified teams, the pros, allows the abuse of strong heroes depending on the meta. So many people say that Mobile Legends is likes to release OP heroes, overpowered heroes, so people are forced to buy them. That was around 2017 to 2019, where every 2 weeks, yes, remember that, especially for the younger players, every 2 weeks there was a hero released. Of course, that was the old times, and I don't want to divert the topic so far away, but the point here is that this a modified team compositions allow so much creativity and combinations, wacky combinations, where you don't have to strictly conform to the archetypes. Like the tank should be the roamer. As long as you have these elements in a team, it can function. It's a traditional but modified. So it still enjoys all the benefits of a traditional team. So, like I explained, that to able to modify the traditional, you should have knowledge. That's why guides like these can help players. So, what roles can I switch? What assassins can I use as a roamer? What mages could I use as XP lane? So that's if the player doesn't know that, you'll end up with an unbalanced team. And another con of this team is that since you forgo traditional picks, example, you pick a melee fighter in the mid lane, or your enemy is a mage, then sometimes you're exposed to more risk, because especially if your hero is countered in the laning phase. So example of that is, if you're I think it goes both ways. You can either counter your enemy or they counter you. Example is a fighter versus mage in a lane. So a fighter is able to clear lanes better in a way, because they don't have they don't have much cooldowns, but a mage can bomb a fighter and force them to recall. So that's just one of the general examples. I'm going to show actual teams, so it's better, one can easily visualize them. So example one, this this team by Echo Philippines is one of their lineups for the championship match against the Blacklist International. So a reminder that Echo Philippines won M4. So you're looking at the draft of the best team in the world as of this guide. So instead of a typical mage, Yushan, an assassin, replaced the mage. In the tank, the team's main sandbag is the jungler. And so see, it's there, it's traditional, but not quite. They modified it. Example 2. So instead of putting the Marksman in the gold lane, Granger is made into the jungler. Because let me explain that Granger can jungle because he's a very mobile marksman who scales early game. So see, Granger still has the elements of a good jungler, early game and mobility. While they put Lunox, a mage, in the gold lane. So it still has the same principles for gold lane, because Lunox scales well late game, especially with items. So see, it's traditional, but things were switched. So let's go to the third team, the multi-tank team, and it's the meta in M4. So it's a team where the jungler, the roamer, and the Exp Laner are all tanks, or at least very durable fighters that could withstand a frontline job. So, uh, so many teams use this format in M4. So the pros of a multi-tank team is they are almost always strong early game, can overwhelm teams with squishier compositions like assassins, mages, and it's almost difficult to invade this team. And especially their backline is so well guarded. So their mage and marksman feel safe behind these three heavy frontliner tanks. And of course, due to the presence of tanks, this team has a strong team fight presence, and there is what I call damage sharing. So one tank doesn't have to take all the damage; they can switch. One can dive, disengage, another tank dive. So see, they could um they could share the overall burden of tanking damage. So cons, you see, I call this the M4 meta, but I listed more cons than pros. So I'm not quite recommending this to beginners because uh, there's confusion. There's role confusion. Because if the team use 2 to 3 tanks, sometimes they do the exact same thing. One tank dives in uh, one this happens a lot from my experience as a tank main, because sometimes I jump, I see an opportunity to initiate, and the other tank jumps along with me. Then my backline, the marksman, the mages, they're all dead because all the tanks just kept on chasing the enemy because we all think the same. See? This kind of team comp need more advanced understanding of the game and communication. So, uh, be- just because a team is tanky doesn't mean that they're unbeatable. So these are some of the cons. They can lose to farm, to teams with better mobility that could just uh, hop all around the map, farm resources, and they could also lose to higher raw damage that could just, um, especially the uh, anti-tank heroes. If I could, some if you're not familiar, there are anti-tank items. So example of that is Demon Hunter Sword. So Demon Hunter Sword has damage based on the opponent's health points. So see, doesn't matter how tanky you are, the percentage of damage will be inflicted on you. There's true damage. Uh, uh, Damage that isn't affected by armor or magic resistance, and there's glowing one, same principle as Demon Hunter Sword. So it's also can be defeated by divide and conquer. So I mentioned earlier that this team is so dependent on team fights. So they're one unit, they're the tank unit, but if you're faster and you can divide the map and take resources, then this team could be overwhelmed by your speed. So example, one of the teams that loved using the tank jungler configuration or multi-tank is the Valley from the USA. So you can see in the example that there are 3 tanks. They're literally classified as tanks in the game. So we have Kufra, Barats, and Glue. So see, it's heavy front line, very durable, but very team fight dependent, because Glue might be a strong tank Exp Laner, but he loses in speed. Other Exp Laners, say like Benedetta, could just split the map, clear minions, move to another objective, and just manage the minion waves better than slower tanks like Blue. So another example is again Echo Philippines, and there are 2 tanks in this picture, Lolita and Akai, and one might say that, hey, Lapu Lapu is a fighter. Yes, he is a fighter, but as of this meta, his current iteration, he is a very tanky character. He can withstand a frontline job and survived all kinds of damage. So, as of this meta, Lapu-Lapu is as tanky as pure tanks. But there are metas that he isn't. So, understand that. So, let's go to the Ube ultimate bonding experience. It's a very team specific draft, and I'll try my best to explain this without making it too long. It's a draft that was developed and heavily utilized by Blacklist International. It's a Philippine team from 2021 to 2022. The main leader of this team, and uh, where Ube is accredited to, is Oh My Venus, the team captain. But one can say that the coach Bon Chan also contributed, and the entire members. So even though the queen of the team is Oh My Venus, I attribute it to the current iteration of Blacklist as a team. So there had been many Blacklist Ube teams from last year. It has also a series of evolutions, but the most current iteration as of M4 consists of a tank jungler, a support, a long range mage that could zone, late game damage, mostly marksman, but can be also be a mage, and an XP lane that could split away and give space to the main group. So, Ube is what people can call a turtling competition. So, not the turtle that we take by that we farm, but the concept of a turtle, a fortress, or an impenetrable unit, Ube. So they depend on grouping tightly together, hugging each other. That's why it's called ultimate bonding experience. So it's very specific. Just because you group together as five, it doesn't mean it's an Ube team. So people have a misconception of that. Ube is not just hugging each other as five. It's a turtle team that has mid game to late game scaling heroes. So it has to be tanky. It has to have damage. So pros of Ube, like it's very similar to multi-tank teams. Difficult to invade. And if the team has supports, healers like Rafaela and Estes, I have never seen Florin used in a professional scene, but theoretically she can. Because of the healers, they just prolong their battlefield presence and add constant pressure. They don't recall. The healer just heals, and they invade and just take the enemy resources away. That's why they're able to scale much faster, even though they're a late scaling composition. So Ube, because usually they have tools to counter divers, so they don't want to separate from their tight formation. That's why they have anti-dive tools, whether it be crowd control or healers. So I recommend Ube a bit to beginners because it's not as difficult to execute. The healer just sticks to the jungler and the mage, and you just rotate together all around the map. However, it has pretty similar cons to multi-tank teams, so could lose to raw damage and mobility. Divide and conquer, because Ube likes to be together. And most especially, they're vulnerable to AoE, area of effect. So if a team loves to group themselves together tightly, then they just bomb them with AoE. Example of AoE, say Claude's ultimate, Lilia, Kagura, and you see most in mostly in our ranks. I mean, as we normal people, the classic counter to Ube is Lu Yi, because Lu Yi's passive is able to burst allies that are sticking together. So see, it's even though Blacklist used this team to be the champion in M3 doesn't mean it doesn't mean it always works. So this is important. It's a 4+1 rotation. The Exp Laner of Ube has to be very good. There's so much burden to the Exp Laner because the Exp Laner is expected to do the typical Exp Lane job and also do team fights and fulfill the typical job of a tank roamer that is missing in this team composition. Samples of Ube. Number 1, the classic Ube. And ironically, my example is not Blacklist, but Incendio Supremacy from Turkey. So, see the key hero of Estes, a tank jungler, late scaling Marksman. So, classic Ube. So, another example is Ube that's centered on Digi. So, Digi negates a diving crowd control skill from the enemy that ables to, and you see there's two tanky frontliners, Edward and Wise, Baksha and Uranus. And example 3, instead of Estes, so you have again a tank jungler, a support, the typical components. And the key Exp Lane here is Edward's Benedetta. See, Benedetta gives space to his teammates to farm and take resources while he does his own thing by his own. So that's Ube. I have a more in-depth article about Ube. I will link it in the thread. And if you're into reading, I highly recommend it if you want to understand the team comp more. Fifth, so we have finished the 4 different kinds of balanced team composition, and we are now on the offensive side. And Bruiser is probably the closer one to a balanced team comp compared to the other ones I will discuss later. So a Bruiser is a draft with a heavy front line and melee damage, relying on aggressive face-to-face clashes of fighters or tanks. In other words, unga bunga. So let's say you just whack the enemy into submission or anything. You just overwhelm them. So by having a Bruiser comp, you can just tear down their formations. Just dive, find their weakest member, and just hunt them down, eliminate them, can steal resources, and it's a pure offense and tanky. The key word in a Bruiser composition is that it's also tanky in a way. And Bruisers can dominate specific drafts. Say a traditional draft with an assassin jungler could be countered by heavy invasive Bruisers, and the tank roamer might not be able to handle these Bruisers because maybe the Bruisers were last picks, or the tank roamer might not have enough tools to ward off these Bruisers. However, like every other team, it has cons. So it has a small margin of error. Bruiser teams don't scale don't scale as well as balanced team. I mean the Bruiser ones, because usually in Mobile Legends there's a trade-off of tankiness and damage. So these Bruisers, they have very strong damage early, but late game they might lose that edge because their opponents have scaled, and their tankiness could no longer endure these higher damage from opponents. So in my personal observation, Bruiser comps tend to feed, especially in lower ranks, or most notorious in this season are Hilda players. They just invade early game, they kill the mage, they kill a jungler, enjoy. Then by mid game, they just don't realize that they're not good anymore. They just keep diving and diving until they have 12 deaths. So you see, it's not a great team for people who have poor understanding of win conditions. So also because it's so focused on offense, their own backline are unguarded. And they kept on diving, their backline gets dived. So it becomes a contest who which backline dives first or survives more. So also bruisers can be countered by anti-dive tools. So one notorious example of anti-dive is Valier. Valier's fireball. So some players ban Valier because they hate him so much. And so much more. Franco a bit, maybe not a hard counter, but if Franco is assisted by other tanks, he just punishes whoever the diver is. So uh, note that Franco isn't a good sole frontliner. I just want to note that because Franco is the team's pure tank, isn't uh, isn't very balanced. So like I said earlier, the offensive bruisers diminishes over time. So when the opponents have scaled in damage and durability, just diving them and going unga bunga isn't gonna work anymore. So it's a high risk kind of it needs skill to execute. So examples. So see, heavy bruiser team consisted of Grok, Lapu Lapu, and Martis. See, if you're familiar, they're heavy dive um, tank and fighters. See, it's a bruiser comp. But I wouldn't say that this team is quite risky because their late game is covered by Beatrix and they have good zoning via Eve. So it's still a quite balanced team comp. Now, this next example is fun. This team by Todak from Malaysia. Todak is a bit notorious in competitions because they tend to pick wacky heroes, and they're fun to watch. So, Death by Snoo Snoo. So, how do you think this team came to be? It's actually a counter draft. It's not made for the sake of putting two muscular women together, assisting a pretty boy. It's drafted specifically to counter a funny opponent, Kyrie from Onyx, Indonesia. So these teams of two Amazon women um, are drafted to counter the funny opponent and allow their own backline and cores like Ling and Carry to farm. So see, it's not drafted just because Hilda and Masha have a tank fighter label. So there are specific in countering a specific enemy. So unless you have the same principle as Todak here, then it's not advisable to draft this kind of team comps because as you can see, both Hilda and Masha just dive, but they don't have any protective tools for Eve and Carrie. Eve and Carrie have to be on their own. And Hilda and Masha are also, how do you describe that? Hit and run. They hit, they tank damage, they dive, then they run. They don't commit like the traditional tanks that stay frontline to make their team safer. They don't do that. So see how the principles of how these teams were drafted. So we're be going to the final category of the type of teams we saw in M4, the glass cannons. So glass cannons can be concentrated on mobility. So these teams are paper. They cannot tank much. They could die easily, but to mitigate that, they have tons of mobility options. They can also immune CC, they can reposition. So the keyword here, which is underappreciated, is disengage, because it's very important. One of the key abilities of mobility compositions is disengage. It's not just being fast. It's not just blinking or having a dash. So disengage is the ability to just retreat and focus on a new objective. So I observe this a lot in my solo queue games in my almost 6 years of playing Mobile Legends, that people tend to, when they have a team fight, they just chase and chase and chase until they die. There's no disengage. But a smart team, a team that is able to utilize their tools, just takes an objective or maybe picks off one target, then retreats, move on to another objective. So that's the specialty of a mobility team. And the most common heroes used in this team are Rafaela and Matilda, because they are the prime movement speed supports in this team. So I don't have a Rafaela example. I'm sure she was picked in one game, but I feel that these examples are more geared towards the idea of a mobility team comp. So again, teams might overlap. So just because a team is mobility, it doesn't mean that it can't be a bruiser. So some teams can be combined. A bruiser mobility team. A team with two bruisers with a Matilda. That's possible. Glass cannon to assault. So I'm trying to find the right words for this kind of team for a long time, but I just settled on assault because, as you can see, it's pure carnage, just pure damage and murder. So Natalia is their roamer. It's an assassin roamer. They have two fighters and two mages. There's no tank. And their safety net in case they die in a team fight is Faramist's altar. So they have a revive tool. So this team is quite risky because they have to they don't have any means of defending their base in case their base is sieged. They're open. They have to conquer the lanes. They have to pick off targets, and it's one of the teams that can divide and conquer and just overwhelm vulnerable lone opponents individually. But they won with this team. They won against Blacklist, if I remember correctly. And this is probably the team that I don't like seeing in my solo queue rank games in low point mythic. Because most of the time, people can't execute this kind of drafts. It's so risky. It requires the players to be really good and coordinated. Even though if you're individually good, but you can't coordinate your offensive strikes or pickoffs, then this team will fall apart. And let's go to a bit of a history, the obsolete draft. So, once upon a time, there was no XP lane, there was no gold lane. As you can see in the mini map here, see where Chang-O and Hylos together in one lane against Masha, and Baksha and Kimi against Claude. So see, how did that happen? It's because there used to be two role dependent buffs. There's no orange or purple, just two buffs that their effects change depending on your role. So if you're an assassin or a marksman, you get different benefits. So it's also much shorter back then. The Lord spawning was I think it was earlier, and so the meta back then was you put a early scaling hero. Specifically, it's the most popular back then was Gusion, Lunox, Kimi, Harith, sometimes Lilia, and later on Esmeralda. And very few marksmen were viable. Yes, the marksman class is so dead during this time, except for these three. Can you point out the common denominator on why these three are viable? I think you know why. And It's movement, of course. The ones like Hanabi, uh, Bruno, because they don't have any kind of mobility, they just end up as um, a buffet food for very aggressive early scaling heroes. Supports were dead, except I think Kaja and Diggy. They were the only supports that were pure supports that were utilized. Healers were not used. And side lane, as you can see in the minimap, is 1 versus 2. So if you say the Exp Laners are Chads today as 1-on-1, well, think of the old meta where it's 1 versus 2. So another obsolete draft is the hyper carry. So if you can see in this picture, before the Roam boots, they were separate items called Roam mask. And because the mask gives passive gold to its bearer, whoever has the lowest gold, the teams realize that, hey, why can't we just equip 5 masks and let the gold flow until we get so rich so quickly? And therefore, there was a time in Mobile Legends history where the teams would just equip 5 masks. And there's a roam and there's also a jungle item. It's such a weird time because back then you can equip a jungle equipment without having the jungle emblem. So you could have a um, jungle equipment but support emblem. See, it's a wacky time. And later on, Moonton realized that they hated this 5-man mask exploit by players. So they nerfed the gold, they adjusted it that only the lowest will benefit. So only 2 people wore masks later on. Still, it's called the hyper carry because they funneled the gold into an ADC. So attack damage carry, it's a character that is able to that is strong late game. So uh, early on when this strat is still in its infancy, they still stuck to the mid lane mages like Gushon Kimililia, but with some reworks, Bruno rework and all, and especially when the buffs were again separated to purple and orange. So the orange benefits physical heroes, the purple benefits magic heroes. So uh, the meta hypers at a period were Bruno Claude carrying Granger, so they force feed gold to this marksman that just scales, that were supposed to scale late and just makes them scale by mid game. And it was a nightmare to be the receiving end of Bruno's um, orange buff balls. So it was a total nightmare. Bruno was busted back then. And later on, the marksmen were adjusted, they get nerfed, and the red buff also got nerfed because the Munton realized how much just tanks just melt from this orange buff. Later on, assassins like Roger and Ling replaced this marksman. So it's a it's a fun time. It's nice to remember these kinds of metas and how it evolves into something more stable post Project Next. And I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope that whatever knowledge or uh, strategy you learn from this, you can use in your ranked games, whatever your goal is. And in my Reddit thread of this presentation, I linked an article about Ube. And thanks for reading my guide. If you have any comments, suggestions, even disagreements or criticism, I'm open to them. We can discuss this in Reddit. Thank you. Thank you.